Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ryan Goulding. I'm from Brocade. This is my colleague. Yeah. So today we had scheduled a topic on NetConf usability. And this is kind of, from AG feedback as well as our own personal experiences dealing with it. So kind of just a funny cartoon here, but sometimes I guess we all feel like this when using NetConf. I want to just put a disclaimer. I think the NetConf team does a stand-up job. This is meant to be constructive and just something that there are a lot of smart people in this room too. So if you feel like you have something to add to the conversation, we'll pass the microphone to you, and please feel free to pipe in. So a lot of good features were added in Beryllium. Some improved logging, spawning via topology configuration instead of loopback. Clustering, and I actually added the last one here, which is the custom schema cache directory per NetConf mount, which allows you to essentially create a repository for each individual mount. So you can go into that repository and modify and munge the model if it doesn't seem to be taking well. So as an outline, we're going to go over a little bit of advisory group feedback. Actually, most of this is driven by advisory group feedback. Then we're going to go through examples of plausible improvements and discussion at the end. And again, I want this to be as interactive as possible. I know this is kind of a formal sort of presentation right now, but please pipe in if you have anything that you want to add. I'd really enjoy hearing it. I think it's only going to lead to good things. So, advisory group feedback. So the first piece of advisory group feedback that I received was distinguish between NetConf protocol issues and Yang schema conformance in the payload. Basically what this means is when you do a NetConf mount or a get operational or get config, no worries. Sometimes you'll get a really nasty exception emitted from org OpenDaylight Yang tools, even though you're really doing NetConf. And this is the point where they're kind of indistinguishable. NetConf is definitely downstream of Yang tools and highly dependent on it. So, the first point is really we want to be able to tell what's going wrong when it goes wrong. We don't want just a Yang tool stack trace. They're very helpful, but unless you're directly involved in writing the code and you know Yang tools pretty well, you're probably not going to know what went wrong. Maybe your model is deficient and don't really know where it is. At this point, too, it's very hard to tell which model actually broke the whatever specific NetConf operation you're performing. Another piece was, a loose mode, and this is both for Yang and NetConf. This one's a little bit more debatable. I've heard both ways on this one. So, when I talk to Robert, he often says that application developers really want to depend on the model and the validity of the data as it's enforced by Yang. But there are certain cases where, maybe my device doesn't have a type for a leaf, for example. And, I still want to use it. I still want to use the model. Maybe I can just assume the string type just so that it'll load. And, the point at the bottom is this has to be optional. This has to be a strategy pattern because there's certainly a lot to be said that, it's made it through the Yang parser checking. So for schema conformance, we want to do it pretty much per model tweak. And the caching change that I made, where you can specify a custom schema cache directory, kind of enables this sort of behavior because you're allowed to mutate models for specific mounts while leaving the other ones intact. Another piece of advisory group feedback was, loose mode should only apply when violations are not structurally ambiguous. So, probably shouldn't try and parse bad XML, of course, or anything like that. But one thing we could do that makes it a little bit easier is, inferences on the namespaces. Right now, as you can see, like 75% of this payload is just the namespaces continually repeated. So if we could do something that, infers the namespace, it could help when things don't actually specify it. And there's also a desire for some sort of pass-through mechanism. So right now, when you do like a get operational, it's going to go through NetConf northbound. It's going to grab it from the device. It's going to go back to OpenDaylight. We're going to parse through it, and there may be optional. There may be some exceptions that we encounter. The idea right now is, maybe we want to just get whatever the raw output the device is sending back. This could really help with debugging. So right now what I do is I use PyYang when something actually goes wrong to debug these issues, but we really ought to have a mechanism built right into OpenDaylight to help with this. So I do a get operational, I go out to the NetConf device, I get whatever payload back asynchronously, and it's returned to the user. And just display the raw response. We don't need to do anything special with it necessarily. And this could even be helpful on an application level. If applications don't deem that they need very strict parsing, maybe they can use some of this and glean some of this data for something useful, even just displaying. So the biggest overall feedback that I got, and what really sticks as important to me, is expect the users to come up with the esoteric conditions down the road. There are going to be devices out there, and I'm sure all of you have dealt with these lovely devices, that might not implement it correctly or fully standardized. And you have to realize that a lot of times it's easier just to maybe make a change in the OpenDaylight server to be a little bit more accepting, rather than go out and upgrade firmware on 100 switches. It's also, we need some tolerance, maybe in the acceptance, so that if we're in a deployment scenario, we can change these sort of things on the fly.
I like to phrase this as we shouldn't punish users for their vendors' bad behavior. I think it's given that we're trying to provide software to users and make them happy.
You want to give them the microphone?
I just like to phrase that as sort of an axiom, which is that we ought not to punish our users unduly for their vendor's bad behavior. And I say this coming as a vendor, from a vendor that has occasionally had bad behavior. So but I think we all have. So it's probably we have, as OpenDaylight developers, we have end users want to actually use the product and get things done. We ought to make that possible and not hold them hostage until their vendors ship them new firmware.
Well said, thank you. So I'm just going to go over a few examples of plausible improvements that I've thought of based on the AG feedback. And some of these might be a little bit harder, might not be able to be done too easily, but there's certainly things to think about. And as we go into this this new planning session for the next release, things we ought to keep in our mind as possible improvements to make this a lot more usable. So enhanced feedback and exceptions. I will preface this with there was a lot of good work done by the NetConf team in Beryllium to clarify exceptions, etc. But we really do want to know what's wrong when a model is not able to be parsed. And right now it's very hard to determine. It's even hard to determine which model might have caused an issue. Pass-through mechanism. Right now I have to use PyYang, which is a little bit embarrassing. We're in our third year of development on OpenDaylight, and we have to rely on other tools sometimes to do this debugging. Maybe a strategy implementation that allows looser interpretation of Yang, and that one I'll go into a little bit deeper here. Maybe assume a default type for a leaf if it does not exist. You might be saying you could just add it in the schema cache directory, which is true right now, but it's just a plausible improvement we could make. If a model does break, when you mount a device, if one model is just a bad model, we shouldn't discount all other models. There might be still some useful information that you can get. For ranges, if you have a range for a certain leaf, if something's out of range, maybe we should still allow it. That one might be a little bit tougher, and I know that goes into some binding stuff that even I'm not too familiar with, but just ideas. And lastly is actually one that Bala brought up, which is a more consistent RESTconf interface, because RESTconf usually is used to control NetConf, There's NetConf northbound as well, the SSH interface, but
I just want to add one point on that slide, actually. The discount for the broken models, there is a flag internally in the Yang tools, do not do strict validation, but that is not exposed, not bound when you mount the device. So internally, the strict validation is always assumed. So it's always, even if there's a catastrophic error in terms of parsing a model occurs, the whole device is not mounted. So probably things like that could be surfaced, not bound, so that the user of the device can determine whether that model is important to him or not. Because often it happened, both in our experience, that there is one model that the user absolutely didn't care about, but because of error in that, we could not even able to mount the device. So that's the one thing. The last point is, in some cases we have seen, both all of us here, NetConf is working, but the thing is, to reach NetConf layer, you have to go through RESTConf, but that RESTConf is kind of broken in terms of some RPCs or some put requests and some post requests. So we have fixed many of those things in Beryllium and also in Lithium, especially the put and the post, and we are still working on some of the RPC stuff. And also, as a part of that, there is another layer to it, which is the API Doc Explorer, which actually exposes all your models for the programmers. Even there are issues there too. I mean, even though the RESTConf is working, the API Doc Explorer has some issues. So there are multiple layers of issues, usability issues that we have fixed, we have identified, and also we are working on some of those things.
so lastly, it was just kind of a slide to say discussion. Another funny picture on usability at the bottom here, but the whole reason for doing this wasn't to say, hey, what we have now is crappy. I think that's very good, but I wanted to kind of generate some discussion, and maybe if any of you have any feedback from doing this yourselves and mounting your own devices, of ways we might be able to improve NetConf. I felt like I was going to get an awkward silence here. Sorry, what was that? Oh, it definitely does help, but I don't know if it solves all. Yeah.
The bigger problem with sideloading schemas that I've found is figuring out what needs to change. Like generating the correct sideloaded schema is time-intensive, error-prone,
Exactly.
and mostly involves plugin.
So the sideloading, I had done that once actually, because we were doing something, there was a bug, and we had to sideload. But the thing is, sideloading, you had to ensure all the models, all the submodules, all the dependencies. And if you see the payload of the thing, I mean, you have to give all the namespace, all the version number. It is so verbose that there is a 99.99% of the chance that you will go wrong most of the time.
And I think Greg has a really good story about it. It turns out at the end of the day, the things that we give him a number between 1 and 10, and it gave him 11. But how long did it take you to figure out that was what happened?
I never used the term sideloading, so we're talking about preloading.
Yeah.
Most people who are evaluating ODL would give up before they successfully work around a simple little XML problem.
And so in this case, the schema, I think there was a schema that said, I forget it was 1 and 10, but it promised the value between X and Y, and it gave like Y plus 3. And as a consequence, you just didn't get any data back. And extracting and essentially you had to go to PyEng in order to be able to get something that didn't actually bother to parse the schema, to be able to give you back data, and then stare at it, and it'll stare at it sideways. There was no way to extract from OpenDaylight.
In reality, vendor devices will never comply with standards. We learned this with SNMP. There's always a variation.
Yeah.
If you're going to be useful, you have to mount the device as it is.
Well, as a case in point, like there was among other things, there is still an honest disagreement about whether or not in using Yang 1.0 with a default statement, that the node when you do a read should be present or not. and it's sufficiently ambiguous that there is a follow-on RFC that describes additional modes to enable that cause it to be, you explicitly state whether you want them or not. But without that extension, so there's enough ambiguity, even while saying later implemented it perfectly, there's enough ambiguity in the spec that I think that you need this. Even if vendors were, there was no cruddy implementations, that there is a disagreement on the Yang tools mailing list about whether that's you should or should not actually store and return default nodes in the Yang data store. And I actually, having read the spec, I still think it says you should, but clearly not everybody agrees. So that's just more example of you really do need something that looks like this. Side-loading modules is quite efficient there.
Yeah, regarding the RFC, since you brought it up, I just remember one instance where RFC doesn't state anything. For example, this is one of the use cases we just went through, one of our own devices. It imports the same model twice. It's really error in the Yang writer, but it's not catastrophic. So they tested with other tools. They were happy with it. You import the same model twice. You give a different prefix, and the prefix is unique, and everybody's handling fine. Whereas when we mounted on ODL did not like it at all because he's saying you are importing the same model twice. The vendor tells me, show me an RFC where it says you cannot import the same model twice. I mean, it's obviously it's not a good practice. We agree to that. We are going to fix it. But show us in the RFC where it's not allowed. I mean, those kind of stuff. Probably we could have just handled it within the Yang tools.
We can beat this at horse forever. I think the trick is that we need one, ways to figure out what's wrong, and two, ways for users to recover easily without having to get a firmware patch from their vendor. And I would think that easily and without having to get a firmware patch from their vendors would be mission consistent, but I'll just leave that out to make sure. Like that's, and I don't think like even if all the end result of this is that we get people agree that that's a reasonable thing to do, that we should say users should be able to figure out what we're wrong and fix it on their own, that would make me happy.
Yeah, consider the case where there is a firmware upgrade that breaks. All of a sudden, all your devices disappear from the controller.
Yeah, I don't think that we're trying to promote bad behavior, but
Ryan, I think we need to spend 5 minutes about the fix that you did, the schema cache.
Do you want to talk about tools that we have? I don't know.
I think we should tell how it definitely solves the problem. You want to tell them?
okay, I guess. I don't have like a demo or anything for you guys.
It's not,
I
not a
apologize.
demo,
Yeah. So there's sufficient ambiguity if you don't actually specify a revision date in an import statement, where you're supposed to just kind of assume that the model that you're importing was the one that was available at the time. What we ran into was with, I believe it was IETF, net types.
Yes, IETF NETCONF monitoring.
Yeah, okay. We were importing, well,
So,
2013 version
Yes.
in our device. Our devices all assumed that it was a 2013 version. In OpenDaylight, we assumed it was 2010 version, and that was done because of various reasons. I guess that the resolution of revisionless imports was non-deterministic, so you didn't really know if you were going to get the 2013 or 2010 version. So, you know, what people in Pantheon team did was nicely add in the 2010 version, so it was deterministic at least. You could figure out that, hey, I'm at least going to get this one. But, you know, it kind of sucked if you assumed the other way. So we assumed 2013. What we did is we basically allowed you to specify a schema cache directory. So I think all of you in this room are probably familiar with the fact that there's a cache directory with all the Yang models, or maybe. So there's a leaf now when you mount that's exposed. Either it's in both spawning by topology configuration and loopback. So it's called schema cache directory. It'll allow you to put in a new directory where all the models will be loaded. So what that in effect allows you to do is go into that folder, change the model there to specify the 2013 version in our case, and it won't affect the rest of the controller. So anything else using the IETF NetConf monitoring still gets the default file that was included in OpenDaylight.
Yeah, that's a great fix. Only one thing I want to add is this lets you a facility where you can mention a device-specific folder. Uh, Traditionally, if you see, we have only one cache folder where all the YANG files from all the devices, including the ODL itself, is stored. So what that means is, if a version is already there, it won't be downloaded from a device at all. For example, if a IETF iNet types 2010 version is there, even if it's customized, if the version is not changed, from a device it won't be downloaded. This gives you the facility to provide a per device cache so that all the YANG files from a device can be self-contained, and they don't have to work well with others. So this is extremely useful, especially if the standard IETF files are customized for whatever needs. So that's a great fix.
Yeah, and the other nice thing about that one in particular, not to promote my own changes here, but it's allowed to be reused. So say you have like tons and tons of Viata devices, for example, that did this one thing and it assumed one interpretation. You can just reuse it, so it's pretty efficient.
How many people know what a schema cache directory is?
Well, Thomas, of course.
So that's the directory where all the YANG files are downloaded when you mount a device, including your own controller when you do a loopback mount.
Do you let it download first, edit it, and then export it?
So it downloads into the new folder, then you're going to have to edit it yourself and then restart the controller. It unfortunately requires that extra step at this point. But as Bala mentioned, it's going to download the one that your device specifies. So if your device specifies it, you don't really have to do anything. In our case, we're pretty lucky with that. So
Even if that version file exists in the other cache, since you're specifying a new cache, that file from the device is downloaded, so everything is in sync. So even if other devices have mishandled the standard file, it will not affect your device because that folder is completely self-contained.
And you only have the 2013 version in that case. You don't have the 2010 version.
So just one question because I don't know very well this plugin. So today in the config system for this plugin, there is nothing to say, okay, relax, you're checking on the YAML model or try to do less of that because that seems to be one of the problems, right? Yeah, okay.
Maybe Thomas can speak a little more.
What's more problem with control again? Because we rely on plugins to do all parsing for us.
Oh, it's YAML tools then, okay.
Yeah, it's highly tied to the Yang tools parser. So.
Okay.
All parsing is done.
Because it would be useful now, I mean, not disable this by default, but if you have many issues pointing, okay, let's disable all the checking and see what happens. No?
Yeah, but we need parsing to allow us to do that. I mean, we can do something like maybe parser that we start tomorrow and rely on everything else to be like any XML. That should be possible, but
I think that, yeah, right now it's very strict, and I guess that's the whole point of this talk is maybe we need to create some mechanisms to make it a little more friendly.
Yeah, exposing that do not do strict flag, not bound, is going to be really helpful because it's there in the code. The code handles it based on the flag in the YANG tools. If a particular model is not, if you don't stay strict, even if it is that model is catastrophic error, it continues with the rest of the models. The functionality is there, but it's not exposed when you mount the device.
I wonder if the reason is so strict because if you deviate a little bit from whatever we understand is the standard, then maybe we cannot parse or something in place. Maybe not, I'm not sure.
There's always a tension between wanting to be as strict as you possibly can in order to try and let people on top of you have the best possible environment. So that way they have to kind of handle a few corner cases. Like the reason you put ranges in Yang schemas is so that way when you write your code, you don't have it doesn't blow up. But you always want to have some escape valve, some safety valve that releases when it is when so that way you can say, all right, I get it. You're trying to protect me from myself, but I also need to get my work done. I mean, this is like, how many people use Windows when they changed it so you had by default your account wasn't an administrator? I think it was Windows 7. Did anybody remember this? Every IT department in the world went from clamoring for the feature that they wanted all people to be non-administrators to making all users administrators in the new system because it broke so much stuff that you just had to go back. And so I think we're experiencing something similar here. It's not a bad, and by now I think IT departments have mostly figured it out and they don't let everybody run as administrators. But for about 2 years after that switch happened, everybody was an administrator on every computer in every IT department, still, even though they've asked for that feature. I think we're in a similar state with NetConf and
The other thing you have to be careful of here, and I agree with you, there's a sweet spot, there's a balance to this. What it really comes down to is, how many people here remember Signal? Okay. For those of you who have not been doing this shit since the early to mid 90s, Signal was the thing that you used to specify markup languages like HTML before XML. And it turned out that Signal was so freaking loosey-goosey that it was almost impossible to write a really well-performing parser for Signal. And it was almost impossible to actually reliably. So if you remember all the quirks mode bullshit, if you ever did web development in the IE5, IE6 time, that was exactly because Signal got the sweet spot wrong in the opposite direction. I'm not saying we have it right here, but in the opposite direction. And the result was a bunch of garbage that you couldn't actually effectively work with, and so you get crazy insane behaviors. Things like, you know, gee, if you put this magic element here, this other thing cascades out. And so, you know, I agree that there's a balance, but we do have to be cognizant of the fact that we could actually go too far to the loosey-goosey side.
No, that's fine. I don't think anybody's asking for us to like say like we'll do no validation by default. I think what we're asking for is a way.
We want the knobs.
Yeah.
We're nerds. We like knobs.
Yeah.
What should be the granularity of the relaxed parsing? Can you just say, just for this device, do a relaxed parsing?
You could do that. It should be. You could do that. I mean, that's why if you give it up as a part of the mount device, you could say for this device, do not use a strict validation. You could do that.
You do have to be careful with one other thing, which is you then also have to let the application indicate whether it's going to be tolerant of loose parsing. Because if I'm writing an application and the constraints say that I will get values between X and Y, or the constraints say that, you know, between X and Y, and so that's not something I have to write in my code because that's being done for me. And I'm not doing whatever checking I have to do semantically about that because it's already covered syntactically, then you can wind up in a situation where that penalty does terrible things.
That's a very valid argument, and Robert's made it many times. I agree with it. I think that they're, you know, having the ability to kind of control it, though, is...
True. That's why if you give it per mount device level, it's for example, if you're mounting a Juniper device or Cisco device, the user of the device has intimate knowledge of the device. So device handles certain.
That's not it. So what Ed is saying, which is correct, is that if I, Colin Dixon, write an application internally against a gang model that says nobody can throw it, and my code relies on that, and I don't know how my code is going to rely on that in such a way that it literally won't work, but if it literally will catch fire and like burn a hole through your disk drive, if it's 11, I ought to have a way to be able to say, if you can't promise me it's going to be in 0 and 10, don't even show me the data. I would again say that, you know, I'm a big user advocate. I would say if Greg is using Colin's application and he says he's willing to take on the risk of running Colin's application, even though it swore that it might burn a hole through his disk drive, that Greg should probably also have the authority in order to be able to do that if it's reasonable for us to give it to him. Now, I'm not saying we should make it easy, but I'm a big advocate of like users should be able to, if they understand the risks, do what they want to do with the things that they have on their computer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of, am I the only one who remembers LaTeX? Please tell me there are other LaTeX users. So the beautiful thing about LaTeX is that it is trivially easy to produce beautiful documents, and you can also, down to the pixel level, do anything you want. But the uglier the shit you're trying to do, the dumber the shit you're trying to do, the harder it gets. And I think that's really the gradient you're looking for here. The tricky part, though, is, you know, right now we're in a model in an environment where NetConf is relatively young. So the number of shared models across different vendors and different devices is relatively small. But I can absolutely foresee a time when I write an application against the foo model to manage fooish things, and I have foo model support on vendor A, B, C, D, and E, and I actually write my application to trust the schema's assertion about something there. And so if vendor A is screwing with me, giving me something that doesn't actually match the syntax, I think we're perfectly fine with 5 out of 6 vendors. And so, my point is, I'm not saying we don't do this. What I'm saying is, it's more than just the per device. There's something to think of a step up.
Good point, Ed. Yeah.
Maybe it could be an attribute of where the data was mounted, this was part was relaxed.
I'm a huge fan of passing metadata. I'm a huge fan of passing metadata and enabling people to use it. I'm also, but like, what I think has driven this frustration, and I would caution us to not just punt it up the stack one level. What has driven this frustration is not sloppy NetConf kind of thing. That is a manifestation of a deeper thing, which is that users have been left in a position where they do not have the tools they need to be able to get the things which they own behave, even though there are relatively straightforward ways that should be possible. And so if you make it so that way applications are now the guardian of what is true and honest and good, and they still end up imposing the same pain and frustration on users, we haven't fixed the problem, we've just punted it out one of them.
Yeah, but again, the problem is you actually get both sides of it, right?
Yeah.
So the application is the arbiter. If we put that up one level, the application is strict, then you're right, we sort of move that problem. But likewise, if we move the frustration from my vendor syntax doesn't check out, and so I crap out early because my vendor syntax, to my application not something it should never have gotten, and so my application craps out, you've also just moved the ball there.
No, I agree, 100%. The trick is just users should be able to pick their tolerance of risk and whether or not they can fix the problem. And if it turns out it's fundamentally unsolvable, we haven't made anything worse. We've just made it we've kept it fundamentally unsolvable. Or your case about is a little in-between space where like, I understand what I need to do.
Yeah, and the knobs.
In my head.
I mean, quite honestly, it's not obvious to me either way. It's not obvious to me that the problem can be made better, or it's not obvious to me that it can't be made better. I'm just kind of cataloging some of the considerations that come immediately to mind.
Yeah, the other thing is these knobs need not be mandatory. It could be just optional. Like there are so many optional fields today when you connect a device. So you can assume the defaults, which is what. So I mean, these could be optional knobs that the user can use if they. To Colin's point, if we provide the optional knobs, probably if somebody's using it, at least they'll be able to mount the device and use it, and solve the immediate problem.
I just want to make sure we don't bake opinions fundamentally into our code, so that way users are forced to live with them.
That's where we are now. Right now, the philosophy that all vendors should be perfect gang models is baked in, and you can't even, you can't figure out why you can't mount a device because the device is returning 11 instead of the range of 1 to 10. And you will give up 9 times out of 10 before you.
So I think the thing, so there are certain things we can always, I think we can probably all agree on, which is, unless for some bizarre reason it's massively expensive that I can't fathom, that you should get a very clear error that you can figure out what the fuck just happened, right?
I'd argue if the device speaks NetConf and you can log into it, it should stay mounted. If one
That may be another argument.
If one Yang file has a problem, the other 49, you should be able to rewrite them and see them in the API docs. Or because chances are you don't care about that game.
No, absolutely. I mean, this gets back to I suspect there are small things we can agree on, small things that can be made better.
And I think most of them I think stem from this axiom, which is that a user should be able to figure out what went wrong, and within reason, tune knobs to allow themselves to take on the risk and try and succeed, even if the parts are there with them. And within reason, I think is how far you are pushing. But I think most people would say we're not there yet.
And to add the operational language, if I'm on a support call with the controller guy, he's not the guy that can upgrade or mark. I want to fix this problem in the controller quickly.
Yeah. All right, so this is all about NetConf usability. We have 14 minutes left, but other things you want to talk about?
Yeah, I have another question regarding the proxy functionality you explained there. What is that about? Because my understanding was that you are always browsing information from the device. So what is the issue around there? You can explain a little bit more. If that was an issue, because I saw you put it in your slides.
I'm not sure which one you're talking about.
Something like proxy the information from the device. Yeah, this one.
Oh.
What is the issue here? Because this is the normal behavior, no? Or it's not?
So right now, when you do something like get operational, it's going to go through the parser regardless. What we would ideally have is a piece of functionality. Maybe it's a different REST endpoint that you can hit that will just give you the raw output from the device. And this is very helpful with debugging. So you'll still see whatever your device is, giving you back. And maybe it won't be parsable, but it's right now the reality is you have to go and use something like PyYang to get.
So only other way is you had to set the debug level to trace or something, then dump all the communication
lot
between
of
the device
output.
and everything, then dump the output. That's the one way. But his suggestion is
Provide a
make it a
yeah.
make it a feature.
Okay, I think I understand.
That's really all I had. If anybody else has any other questions or comments.
You would like to straight up via REST, or how do you foresee this feature?
I would see it as an alternate REST endpoint. So right now we have get operational. There might be like another REST endpoint that's passed through.
Dump XML.
It's just a diagnostic tool, really. I mean, you could still even use that information in your application, maybe a UI, to display what the actual operational raw output is. And it could help you debug possibly why it's not parsing correctly.
Yeah, that's cool. Is the debugging part of it on the NETCONF? Yeah.
Also, if we have some common issue with the models that you encounter, maybe to group them up in one place so you can try to figure out how to solve the problem.
Yeah. I mean, it helps as a tool even for vendors designing these devices. They then have some feedback where they can actually go and adjust their own models. Do we have anything else? Well, I guess with that, you guys get a couple minutes back.
I was fine with that. I was saying that we should make it so that way whenever there's an exception in OpenDaylight log, you should append to the end of the exception the mailing list you should send the exception to. To get it fixed. You know, serious, and I mean that seriously because one of the problems we have with our users is that they go to try and figure out what's going on, and they go to the mailing lists, and then they stop because there's 50 of them. And so this has two really nice properties. One of them is it's strongly, and so if you make it so that way it's actually read from the module name, it strongly incentivizes people to make their code either very usable exceptions or fewer exceptions. And whether or not that backfires on me by incentivizing people to just throw them off the stack to something else, we'll see. So one of them is serious and one of them is not so serious. But the serious part is that people actually do really have trouble figuring out where to email. And so like, I don't know, do any of you subscribe to OpenDaylight users? Okay. So let me tell you that like, you know, we have this weird system set up where we don't communicate to users what project they're in, we don't communicate to users where the exceptions are coming from, or even that they're our project, and yet the only way to get help is to get it to the right project list, which is problematic. And so in that sense, I'm really serious, but I also think that it might help people to get, like, if you get lots of emails about exceptions,
In some cases that will help a lot. In some cases it won't. So I was just actually conspiring with Colin about how we can make a custom appender to do this out of covers and never help. But there are some places. I mean, one good example is if you produce a completely flawless config file to the config subsystem, you will get a config subsystem error. That 90% of the time is not actually rooted there.
well,
Yeah.
that would be a really good time to fix the exception to document what this should actually, where people should actually go look. I mean, I agree. I have to
It
mistake.
actually does tell you as much as you can be told.
So my experience a lot of times is config pusher gets blamed for everything. And the reason config pusher gets blamed for everything is because it's the top of the Java stack.
Yes.
So when an exception pops all the way off the top of the stack, the config pressure throws the exception. And as somebody who's been somewhat involved in OpenDaylight, I would hope that I was pretty good at debugging errors. But I would say until about 6 months ago, that didn't quite make sense to me. So fixing that, like things like if you just started getting in a loop where exceptions started getting users to interact with us, you would I think we would discover what error messages would help.
Basically, it does two things. You want to have the mailing list there. You also want to have the place to appropriately file it up. But again, I think you can, this will not be a perfect process. But you could, it is a lovely job, project that you could stick an intern on to write a custom appender that we could just let the covers interact. That would do the translation
improve usability of OpenDaylight in general.
And when it emails it, it attaches the carafe log too.
Seriously, you can put all kinds of instructions. I mean, like the idea that we don't have a way to basically put like
Yeah, passwords in plain
please
text.
attach Etsy password and